Back in 2018, I decided to try the Inktober challenge. I didn't find any list that particularly struck me as interesting, so I decided to make my own, and I themed it around Dungeons and Dragons monsters. The Bone Devil made its first debut on day 2, and a lot of my friends who were interested in my art at the time really liked it. And I really didn't like it. And at the beginning of this year, I said I would do a Bone Devil that I could get behind. When starting to visualize the character, I remembered why I had such a problem with him in the first place all those years ago. It's hard to find an adequate pose that shows off his entire body while also displaying him as sufficiently menacing and frightful. Some coiling and contorting was to be expected if I was going to fit him inside of a frame. So in that regard, the first one is simply a warm-up sketch. At attempt number 2, I decided to play around with his head and eyes, specifically one eye. I wondered what would happen if I made him a Cyclops. The pose wasn't doing it for me, but I really liked the single focused eye. I tried shifting the pose a bit, reworking the horns to make them more bug-like. The latest iterations of the Bone Devil depict him having insect wings, and while I can kind of understand it, it's something that posed a bit of a challenge in this instance. I was still unsure if I was completely going to rework the design or if I was just going to play around with it a bit. I would eventually stick to tweaking the design instead of reworking it. This version is also the first one where I introduced the shoulder bones. I knew I wanted to emphasize his rank above the other devils, while also giving him some practical defenses. The more I think about this version, the more I realize it was just an expression piece. For the last couple of years, I tried to reduce the amount of pencils I put into my works because I knew that eventually I would ink them digitally. And this piece was me returning to that love and just getting lost in the process. The most radical and alien departure by far, and one that was the most interesting in its own right, was design number 5. It looked too much like an alien insectoid rather than a bone devil. The thing I realized in this design is that I wanted my bone devil to be bony. I was starting to realize that I wanted the design to be slimmer, and an overexpressed exoskeleton wasn't the way to go about it. This version is still one of my favorites. I like the pose, I like the lanky nature, but trying to fit in the wings and the tail proved too taxing. I also made his head uglier. Now, while we are talking about devils and their aesthetic value shouldn't really be a point to focus on, there is a right and a wrong way to go about this. There does indeed exist a difference between conventionally scary and disgusting scary. D7 was me still coming to the realization that I wanted the devil to be thinner while also fooling around with the head. It was the first time I was considering giving the bone devil hair, since insects have hair. BD8 is where triclopsy first popped into my head. The eye sockets would still be empty, but having 3 of them helped push the buggy theme. It was also the point where I realized I would have to broaden my search queries and expand my reference pool. It's then that I realized that a good place to start would be the late H.R. Geiger's Xenomorph. It had a tail, lanky body, and could hopefully provide me some pose ideas. Attempt number 9 is when I started to compress the design and tried to play around a bit with angles and foreshortening, if even for a tiny bit, while also trying to work in the wings. This isn't the last time I would try to incorporate the wings, but they're a feature I would eventually denounce. This was day 20 and I still didn't have a viable product. It's then that I realized that I should start looking elsewhere for inspiration. Thankfully, World of Warcraft's new expansion includes winged taily creatures that I have quick and easy access. Hold on a second. As I was saying, with the addition of a model viewer and its preloaded posing, I had much more room to experiment with dynamic angles. And this method did create several designs. None of which are part of the final product, but you know, it's a process. This guy just came out looking too thin in some places and too thick in others. I also considered giving him a traditional pair of bat wings, but quickly moved against it. this is also one of the designs that didn't include the bony shoulders. This guy is the physical manifestation of my declining mental state. I was playing around with the legs, the expression, more hair, implicit triclopsy with bones around the eye hole mimicking a second and third eye, as well as the return of the horns, if in spirit only. Death 13 is where things started to make sense. I was making a lot of mistakes with my ribcage placement and muscle layering. It was a frustratingly humbling experience. Also, I really like the expression on this guy. Now this is where things started to get really interesting. An integral part of this creature would be its relation to, well, its bones. Examining how the musculoskeletal system works in real life, the bones provided a frame for muscles and other tissues to work around. But when we're talking about a fantastical creature that already breaks the rules of nature, we are not only invited to, but obligated to push the limits of what's possible. It's at this point that I started transitioning away from the standard human anatomy and started to extrude the ribcage as an actual defensive feature while also merging it with the shoulder spikes. It's also the first time backbones appeared. At first, I was thinking about having them work together with the wings, but the more I looked at them, the more I decided against it later on. BD15 was working with previous designs while trying to fit in the devil's hooked polearm. I didn't work on it a lot, and it's plain to see. I moved on from it fairly quickly. The 16th attempt was a return to WoW Model Viewer while incorporating the design changes so far. I liked it, but I still felt like it was lacking something. But definitely a step towards the right direction. This is the design I was sure would be the one. I got far enough into the process that I started digitally working on it, only to again feel a bit hollow. It was too lanky in some ways and too thick in others, and the ethereal wings could work for a separate design, just not this one. One of my friends said it looks like a Bionicle, and I like that description. I knew I would have to ditch the polearm. The DNA through line is as follows. BD2's Cyclop eye, that will eventually become BD8's Triclop design, BD3's shoulder bones that warped and changed until we got here, BD14's back spikes and general ribcage defense idea, and how it all came together to create what you see before you.
And that's all for this video. There is another fiend I have in mind that I think could use a little bit of tender loving care. But if you have an idea on what I should do next, please leave it in the comments and I'll be sure to check it out. Thank you so much for watching.